Hello and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast by Obus Partners. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And today's show, we're talking about how fast do house prices increase and, what's a fair ballpark to use when you are out there buying properties. It's quite interesting because I recently saw on Facebook, somebody in a property investors, Facebook group said, how fast should I assume that house prices increase? And she actually got so many snarky comments. Like somebody said 17.159%, except no less. And just really ridiculous answers. And I thought, oh, that's a bit sad. So let's dive into the numbers and say, okay, when you are thinking about buying investment property, how fast should you assume that it actually increases in value? Now, you can't really target a specific number because when you buy a property, the market will do what the market would do. But just like when we think about KiwiSaver funds or buying shares or in an index fund, usually you'll use a benchmark. So what benchmark should we use? Now, Andrew, what have we always said on this show?
So we always say for a growth property, so a house or a townhouse, not an apartment, we normally say 5% if it's outside of Auckland, and normally we add a premium on for Auckland and we say 6%.
And why 5%?
Well, Reserve Bank talks about that being kind of a good long-term average. And when we had Tony Alexander on the show, I remember asking him and he said, I can understand that you'd add a premium to Auckland.
Yeah, so he was kind of saying 5% around most of New Zealand, but 6% in Auckland. And on top of that, we recently had Gareth Kiernan from Infometrics on the show. He kind of has said that he's the chief forecaster at Infometrics, and he was saying that 4.5% is his kind of long-term assumption, which is not too far off that 5%. And so I wanted to dig into the numbers a little bit and think about, well, why do we get to 5% before we dig in and say, well, how often have house prices gone up by at least 5%? So usually what we think about is inflation. Inflation is usually 2 to 2.5%. So that pushes the price of everything up over time as money gets devalued. On top of that, you've got household income growth. Typically, household incomes go up by about 4 to 4.1% per year as a compounding average. So that's going to push the price of houses up as well. And so that gets us to about 4%. Once you say 2% for inflation, another 2% for household income growth. And then we usually add on 1% for things like immigration, the fact that building materials get more expensive over time, the fact that labor costs go up, and so it just costs more and more to build a house. And that's how we get that ballpark of 5%-ish, and then an extra 1% for Auckland. But it also does depend on the type of property, right?
Yeah, so if you're buying a house or a townhouse, generally speaking, those go up at pretty similar rates. As soon as you go to an apartment or something quite specific, so like maybe a dual key or multiple income property, so those only, they're not going to be purchased by your average mum and dad wanting to raise their kids there. They're a more specific investor product, so therefore they normally get tied to the income rather than someone's emotion. And so as a result, we normally take off 1.5% if you're buying a high-yielding property.
Yeah, so it's say 4.5% for an apartment in Auckland and about 3.5% for an apartment anywhere else. And one of the things that a lot of people will notice when they're listening to this is it's a lot more conservative than how fast house prices have gone up in the past. Now, if we look between 1992, when the Real Estate Institute of New Zealand actually started tracking real estate data, up until today, house prices around New Zealand have gone up by about 6.2% a year, and it's been 6.9% a year in Auckland. And so we are discounting that quite heavily. But one of the issues when you hear data quoted like that, and you do hear it quoted like that all the time, oh, between this point and this point, it's gone up by 7% or 8% or even 9% in some cases. But the real issue with that is to get that sort of growth, you would have had to buy at whenever they started. So in the numbers I just quoted you, you would have had to buy a house back in January 1992, and that was like 32 years ago. You can't go back in time and buy a house there. And you're only looking at two data points. What was the house worth back then in 1992, and what's the house worth today? And then you're going to average it out. But you need to understand, well, what happened in between there because you're not actually buying. And so one of the things I like to do is look at a graph like this, and I'll explain it for anybody listening on Apple and Spotify, is we calculate, well, how much did house prices go up per year if you bought in June 1994, or what about June 1999, or what about June 2012? And so rather than saying how much have house prices gone up since 1992, you take a snapshot of every single year, because then you can start to get a really, really good ballpark and say, okay, what percentage of times have house prices gone up by 5% or more? And so take us through some of the data points, Andrew. Let's say that we bought a house in June 2002. How much have house prices gone up
So
since then?
a massive 7%. So that's pretty high. Now, tell me, is that from June '02 to now? Is that what you're saying?
To June 2024.
Gotcha.
And so if you bought a house in June 2002, you've actually done better than average, because the average since 1992 has been 6.2%. You're up there at 7%. If you bought a property outside of Auckland, June 2015, it's gone up by 7.9%. You've done way better than that average that we just talked about. But if you bought recently, so June 2022, your house has gone down in value by 3% a year. And so it's no use just saying that house prices always go up by 5% or always go up by 6.2%, because all of us will have different experiences depending on when we specifically bought. We might be better than average. We might be worse than average.
Tell me about this dip in here.
So if we look at June 2007, that is one of the I was going to say worser. Is worser a word?
I don't think so.
I think it's worse.
That's worse or English.
Yeah, okay. It was one of the not very good times to buy a house.
Yeah.
House prices since then have gone up by 4.5% per year. So slightly under that benchmark that we talk about. And that's where, again, it depends when you actually bought the property. To be honest, in the future, I would expect that anybody who bought in June 2022 to actually do okay, because they would have bought, as house prices were still sliding, but at a lower point in the market compared to somebody who bought, say, in June 2021. So the returns you get depend on where you buy. And I'm just trying to show you that it's not always 5%, but most of the time it has been above 5%. So that's a pretty good ballpark to use. If we think in Wellington specifically, rather than just anywhere outside of Auckland, we see a similar trend. Most of the time, if you've held for or owned a property for 8 or more years, you do get above that 5% benchmark that we talk about. So it's a really robust and reasonable assumption if you are holding for the long term. If you are holding a property only for the very short term, then 5% growth per year is actually not a very good assumption, because house prices go up and down.
And when you say long term, you're talking about seeing out a full property cycle, so somewhere between 8 and 10 years, right?
I'd say at least 8 years. But even if you hold a property for longer than that, you might be slightly under that 5% compounding rate, because if you bought in June 2007, which was the top of that specific property cycle, your rate's going to be 4%. So I'm just trying to show you, most of the time, 5% is going to be a very reasonable assumption. But actually, for some people, depending on when you bought, it might be slightly lower than 5%. But about 75% of the time, based on the numbers we're looking at, you'd get at least 5% growth. So I think it's pretty reasonable.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're using anything as an average, you've got to remember that half the time that's going to be lower and half the time it's going to be higher, right?
Yeah, and that's why, even though we said before, hey, it's a 6.2% compounding growth since 1992, we'd discount that down, because you don't want to be right only half the time. The other thing that's quite interesting, though, Andrew, is that a lot of these numbers are influenced by where we are in the market at the moment, which is that house prices have declined. So we've always used 6% as the benchmark for Auckland. And when I ran the same numbers for this analysis, only 40% of the time did Auckland house prices go up by at least 6%. So, yeah, if you bought in June 1992, they would have gone up by 6.75%. But if you'd purchased any time since June 2014, it would appear that right now Auckland has underperformed that benchmark. Now, that is naturally relatively concerning. What's your reaction to that?
Well, do you think that that's because there's a high level of apartments there compared to other parts of the country?
Oh, not necessarily, because remember when I did the analysis of Wellington City, where there are a ton of apartments, I stripped out the apartment values, and actually it didn't make that much of a difference. A lot of this is down to where we are in the market right now, which is the fact that property prices in Auckland have fallen about 22%. And so that's when I said, well, let's not think about somebody who purchased a property in Auckland in June 2007 and say, well, what if they held up into now? Let's just look at a 10-year window that most property investors would hold for. And then the numbers start to look very, very different. So if you purchased a property now in March 2005 and held it for 10 years, you would be well above that 6% mark. And so if you're holding a property for 10 years in Auckland, you'd say, well, actually, 93% of the time, house prices have gone up by at least 6% over any given 10-year period. And so that's again where you start to say, okay, 6% in Auckland is a reasonable assumption, because as long as you're holding a property for at least 10 years, over 90% of the time, the average house has gone up by at least 6% a year.
Which is why you don't want to be selling in a depressed market right now, right?
Yeah, because it's a buyer's market rather than a seller's market. I mean, if you'd purchased a property in November 2011 and then sold in November 2021, your house value, so that 10-year period, your house value would have gone up by almost 11% per year. I mean, I would not use that for anybody in their spreadsheet or to think that that's typical, because it's not typical. But at least 6% is relatively reasonable. Now, before we hit record, I know I've really been going on today. We were talking about Queenstown, and we were having a little. I threw a bit of a tanty, Andrew.
I'm used to it.
Explain what your question was.
So my question was, what do you use for Queenstown? Because outside of Auckland, we'd normally use 5%, but some of the historic growth rates are like 9.55%. But to your point before, that's just 2 points in time, right?
Yeah, and so I just thought, okay, before we hit record, I'll throw together a graph. And what we see in Queenstown is that house price increases over any 10-year period have been a lot more sporadic. And it's just because it is a much smaller region. I mean, how many people live in Queenstown Lakes? It's about, I'm going to throw a number out there. I'm going to get it wrong. I thought it's like 30 to 40,000. How many people live in Queen? I don't know if this is going to make it into the show. NZ. Okay, close to 47,400. Pretty close. Yes, fine, Andrew. I know that it wasn't exactly 40,000, but I was very close.
Well, would you call it 10%? Oh, no, it's more than that.
It's 20% difference.
Yeah, difference. Oh,
yeah,
well.
but it's a swing.
Call yourself an economist.
Oh, Andrew. But because it's a smaller region, you do see that the house price increases are way more volatile. They're way more up and down. And there was quite a sustained period where if you'd bought a property anywhere between September 2002 right through to August 2006 and held it for 10 years, then actually your house value would have underperformed that benchmark. But it's about 75% of the time Queenstown house prices over any 10-year period have gone up by at least 6% per year. So it's reasonable. It's to use that as assumption, but I'd have less confidence in it than saying 6% for Auckland. But having said that, when I look at a lot of the other regions that we often talk about, so for instance, Hamilton would say 5% growth over any 10-year period, 73% of the time it's gone up by at least 5%. Wellington, about 75% again. Christchurch and Dunedin, somewhere between 2/3 of the time to 70%. So, I think these are relatively reasonable assumptions, but bear in mind that if you're buying a property in Dunedin with the intention to hold it for any 10-year period, 30% of the time, it hasn't gone up by 5%, right? 30% of the time, it's gone up by slightly less than 5%. Same for Christchurch City. 2/3 of the time, it's gone up by at least 5%. But 1/3 of the time, it's gone up by less than 5%. And so that's just when you're using these kinds of assumptions and putting it into your spreadsheets. Oh, house price is going to go up by 5%. Most of the time that's happened, 2/3 of the time that's happened in Christchurch, but it's not every single time. So it's not locked in, right? It's not guaranteed. It's sort of guaranteed 5% return.
And I think that's probably a good argument for diversifying your portfolio. If you're going to build a big portfolio, 5+ properties, you do want to be thinking about buying properties in different regions, because not all of them perform at the same rate at the same time as well. So when you do get to the point where you want to liquidate your portfolio, you want to be able to sell the one that's gone up the most and then keep the others for a bit longer, so you can be a bit more certain with the outcome.
And I think it's about moving away from averages and starting to talk about probabilities, because I always think, the old economist joke that the average person is half man, half woman. In fact, there are very, very few people who are half and half. Can I say that? Can I say that?
You have now.
Okay,
sure, I get your point.
No. And it reminds me of the old economist joke that the average person is half man, half woman. But in fact, half the population, generally speaking, is female, and half the population, generally speaking, is male. And so the average is not necessarily representative of everybody's experience. There's distribution. Same when you go and buy a house. The average we talk about might be 6.2%, But most people are not going to be 6.2% outside of Auckland. Some are going to be higher, some are going to be lower. But I think 5% is a reasonable assumption because most of the time, most people are going to get at least 5% growth, at least based on historical numbers. Of course, in the future, these numbers might be slightly different, but looking at the past helps us understand the world of what might happen in the future. Right, let's wrap it up there, but please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Really does help us get the message out to more people. God, this got nerdy today, Andrew. And if you're listening to the podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you want to see some of my lovely graphs, just Google Opus Partners YouTube. It'll be the first thing that comes up. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit the subscribe button because we release new videos on here every Monday and Wednesday. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
I'm Andrew Nicol.
We're going to be back here tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.